I was out in the driveway, running a chamois over the old Ford. The truck, Eleanor and I, bought the spring before the cancer found her, getting it presentable for the drive out to my son's place for Sunday supper, when my phone buzzed against the workbench and skittered an inch across the wood. I didn't even dry my hands. I just looked at the screen and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, because the message was from my attorney, a man who has been my friend for going on 30 years, and who does not text. He calls, always has. And the words on that screen were short enough to read in one breath. Don't sign anything tonight. Whatever they put in front of you, don't sign it. Call me before you walk through that door. I stood there with the chamois dripping suds onto my boot and dialed. He picked up halfway through the first ring, which told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. He didn't bother with hello. He asked me where I was and whether I was alone, and when I told him I was standing in my own driveway, he let out a breath like a man setting down something heavy. He said a petition had crossed his desk that afternoon, a courtesy copy from a lawyer downtown he happened to know. My son had filed to have me declared incapacitated. He was asking a judge for guardianship. He wanted the court to say my mind was gone so he could take control of every dollar, every deed, every account with my name on it. I am 71 years old. I flew commercial aircraft for 34 years, the last 19 of them in the left seat as captain. And in all that time I never put a scratch on a wingtip or a soul in a hospital bed. I have landed a jet full of strangers in crosswinds that would knock a grown man off his feet. 2 weeks before that phone call, my doctor sat across from me and said my blood work looked better than half his 40-year-old patients, and that whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. And here I was, hearing that my only child had walked into a courthouse and sworn under oath that I couldn't be trusted to write my own checks. Before I tell you what I found at that supper table, and what my wife, 3 years in the ground by then, had set quietly into motion from behind a county clerk's desk to stop this exact day, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever had to stand up and fight just to keep your own name, do me the kindness of hitting that like button. It helps an old man more than you know. My attorney wanted me to turn the truck around. He said the smart thing was to skip the dinner, sit tight, let him file a response Monday morning, and I told him no. I told him I was going to that supper. I was going to sit at my son's table and eat my daughter-in-law's pot roast and look the both of them in the eye. 'Cause a man deserves to see the faces of the people who decided he was already as good as dead. He sighed and said all right, but he made me promise 3 things. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything out loud, and when I left, drive straight to his office no matter the hour. I promised. Then I finished wiping down the truck, because the truck didn't have anything to do with it, and a clean truck is a clean truck. I want to tell you about my son. His name doesn't matter as much as what he was, which is a boy I loved past all good sense. His mother and I had him late, after we'd given up hoping, and maybe that's where the trouble started. I gave that boy everything. When he wanted to play ball, I built him a backstop. When he wanted to go to a private college I couldn't quite afford, I flew an extra rotation a month for 4 years, and never told him. When he opened his first restaurant and it went under, I covered the lease. When he opened his second and his third fancy steakhouses with chandeliers and $40 entrees, I co-signed. I told myself I was being a good father. I see now I was teaching him that the floor never gives way, that there is always a check, always a cosigner, always a soft place to land called Dad. I built that boy a world without consequences, and then acted surprised when he grew up believing he was owed one. The drive out to his house takes 40 minutes from my side of Tulsa to his. He lived, in a development called The Reserve. Big stone houses with 3-car garages and lawns that men in trucks come to mow. My daughter-in-law had decorated theirs like a magazine spread. She fancied herself a designer, ran one of those little online businesses showing strangers how to live, and for a few years there it had done well. Lately I'd heard less about it. I should have wondered why. I didn't, because I am, at my core, the kind of man who assumes his family is telling him the truth. She met me at the door in an apron that had clearly never been near a stove. She hugged me, and it was the strangest hug I've ever gotten from her. Dry and careful, her hands flat on my back like she was checking me for something. "How are you feeling?" she asked, and there was a weight on the word feeling that I caught, now that I was listening for it. I told her I felt fine, I told her it smelled wonderful in there. And I stepped inside the house I'd helped pay for and felt sick to my stomach the whole way to the dining room. The supper was a performance, and I had a front row seat to my own funeral. My son talked the whole time, the way he does, about a self-storage development he was getting into. 50 units going up on the east side, the smartest money he'd ever put down. I just nodded and ate. My granddaughter sat at the end of the table with her chin on her hand, 14 years old and bored out of her mind, sweet as anything, completely separate from whatever her parents were cooking up. I'll come back to her because she matters. But at that table, she was just a kid waiting to be excused. It was over the pie that they made their move. My daughter-in-law set down her fork, reached across and laid her hand over mine, and gave me a look so full of concern it could have won an award. "We've been worried about you," she said. My son chimed in, all of a sudden grave, like a doctor delivering news. "You've done so much for everybody your whole life," he said. "You've earned the right to stop carrying all this weight." Then my daughter-in-law squeezed my hand and got to the heart of it. "Let us take some of it off your plate," she said. "The accounts, the taxes, the house, all that worry. Let us manage things so you can just rest." There it was, the whole machine dressed up in velvet. "Let us manage." The exact words my attorney had read me from their own filing 2 hours before. They wanted to help. They wanted to take the controls. "I'll tell you what I did." I smiled. I have a particular smile I used to give a first officer who'd done something foolish at 12,000 feet, calm and slow, and I gave it to my son across that table. I told them it was a generous thought. I told them to let me think on it, and I watched something flash across my daughter-in-law's face, a little spark of triumph she couldn't quite keep down, and I understood that she believed I'd swallowed it whole. She thought she was looking at a confused old man who'd just been gentled into his own cage. At the door, she hugged me too long and whispered that I'd seemed so forgetful lately, that they only worried because they loved me. It wasn't worry. It was a threat, wrapped in perfume. I patted her shoulder and told her not to lose any sleep over me, that I was thinking clearer than I had in years. Then I got in the truck and drove straight downtown to a 10th floor office where the lights were still burning. My attorney had not gone home. He'd taken his jacket off, rolled his sleeves, and laid out a stack of paper on his desk that turned out to be the most painful reading of my life. The petition itself was bad enough, a tidy list of supposed incidents meant to paint me as a man coming apart at the seams. They claimed I'd paid the same bill twice and let my power lapse. The truth was I'd switched to autopay, and there'd been a one-day overlap I'd planned myself. They claimed I forgot where I parked, lost my keys, wandered. The truth was I'd bought a new truck with a different fob and changed a deadbolt the same week. Every single thing on that list was a real, harmless moment, twisted just enough to look like fog rolling in over a failing mind. They weren't lies exactly. They were the truth with its bones broken. But that wasn't what made me sit down hard in the chair. What made me sit down was the second folder, the one my attorney pushed across the desk without a word. He'd pulled what he could on my son and daughter-in-law's finances the moment that petition hit his desk, because after 30 years of handling my affairs, he knew which threads to pull. The steakhouses were gone, all three, shuttered inside 18 months when the lease costs ate them alive. My daughter-in-law's little business had cratered along with everything else. The income she'd built her whole shining life on had dried up to almost nothing. They'd taken a second mortgage on that stone house, $300,000, and it was already spent. They were carrying north of $140,000 in credit card debt. And this was the part that turned my blood to ice water. My son had poured $600,000 into that self-storage development he'd bragged about at supper. Money he didn't have, money borrowed against a house that was already mortgaged twice. The development partner had filed for bankruptcy a month earlier. The money was simply gone, vanished into a hole in the ground on the east side of town. I sat there and did the arithmetic the way I used to run fuel numbers before a long haul. They weren't drowning. They were already on the bottom, and the water was rising over a man worth, on paper, a little over $4 million in a paid-off house with a clean portfolio, his late wife, and he had built one careful decade at a time. They didn't want a loan. They were long past loans, and even if I'd handed them everything in my checking account, it wouldn't have plugged the hole. They needed the whole estate, and the only way to get at all of it, to sell the house, liquidate the accounts, drain it dry, was to take the controls away from the man who owned it, to stand in a courtroom and convince a judge that the captain wasn't fit to fly. My attorney told me the worst of it last. They'd hired an expert, a psychiatrist named Lambert, a man with a reputation in those circles as a hired gun, the kind who gets paid a fat retainer to evaluate a contested old person and almost always finds, with great regret and many credentials, that the old person has lost capacity. He testifies in guardianship fights for a living, and he testifies for whoever wrote the check. By the time we got in front of a judge, my attorney said, it wouldn't be my son's word against mine. It would be my word against a board-certified physician swearing under oath that my mind was gone. I want to tell you that I felt despair. I didn't, not after the first few minutes. What I felt was the thing I used to feel when an engine flamed out, and the cabin didn't know yet, and I had 90 seconds and a checklist. The panic burns off and something cold and clear takes its place. In the cockpit you learn one thing above all others. When the alarms are screaming, you do not react to the alarm. You run the checklist. You trust your instruments over your fear. And sitting in that office at 10 o'clock at night, I started to run a checklist. I told my attorney I didn't want to play defense. He'd been building toward a defense, medical records, a clean bill of health, character witnesses. I told him to set it aside. They were building a case that I was a confused old man, and I was going to give them the most confused old man in the state of Oklahoma. Starting the next morning, I would forget things. I would call my daughter-in-law twice in an hour with the same question. I would misplace things and call in a panic. I would let them believe every single day that their plan was working perfectly. And while they got comfortable, while they got arrogant, my attorney and I would document every move they made, until they'd walked so far out onto the ice that there'd be no way back. They were expecting a victim. I was going to give them prey, right up until the moment the prey turned around. He looked at me for a long while, and then a slow grin spread across his face, the grin of a man who has waited 30 years to take the gloves off. He picked up a legal pad and asked me where I wanted to start. I want to be careful here, because folks watching at home will want to know whether what I did was legal, and the reason matters. Oklahoma is what they call a one-party consent state. That means a man is allowed to record a conversation he himself is part of, in his own home, without asking permission from anybody. I didn't need consent from my son or his wife to record them sitting in my living room scheming against me. I only needed to be in the room. My attorney confirmed it twice and put it in writing, and then I drove out to an electronics supply house the next afternoon and bought what I needed. I didn't buy some toy nanny camera off a shelf. I bought good small lenses and good microphones and a recorder that would push every second up to a cloud only my attorney and I could reach. I spent my whole career trusting instruments. I knew how to set them. Then I started acting. I called my daughter-in-law at 6:30 in the morning, my voice thin and lost, asking for a phone number she'd given me the week before. She sighed that big theatrical sigh and told me it was on the list on my refrigerator. An hour later I called again and asked for the same number, and I heard the silence on the line stretch out while she did the math, while she filed away this delicious new piece of evidence. And when she finally spoke, it was in that syrupy voice you use on a child, telling me not to worry, she'd come by and help me get organized. I thanked her like a man grateful for crumbs. The bait was in the water. For 2 weeks I was a marvel of decline. I let the stove timer go off so the alarm company would call them. I asked my son what day it was. I let my daughter-in-law sit beside me at my own computer and pay my bills, and I watched her quietly type her own email address in as the recovery contact on my bank login, and I said nothing, and the camera in the bookshelf got all of it. She was so patient. She was so kind. She thought she was watching a lighthouse go dark. The day she brought the papers, I knew it was coming. She called ahead, bright as a penny, said she had some simple forms, nothing to worry about, just something to let her and my son help with the bills. An hour later, her car pulled into my drive, and she sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, square in the view of the lens hidden in the mantel, and pulled a thick stack of pages out of a leather folio. "Just some standard paperwork," she said. She fanned it out, then pressed it flat with the heel of her hand, her thumb landing square on the top line of the front page, covering the title. She pointed to a yellow tab at the bottom. "Right there," she said. I leaned in and squinted and asked her, in my best fog, What all that lawyering said up at the top? It's nothing, she said, smooth as butter. Just standard authorization language. I reached for the pen and let my hand bump the stack, just enough to knock it crooked, and for one clean second her thumb slid and the camera caught what was printed across the top of that page in plain bold letters. Durable power of attorney. She caught it too, snatched the pages straight, slammed her thumb back down, told me to please be careful. And I picked up the pen and I held it over that yellow tab, and I looked at my son's wife and I set the pen back down. I told her I thought I'd have my friend look it over first. The disappointment that crossed her face, just for an instant before she smiled it away, was a thing I will remember on my deathbed. When she left, I called my attorney and told him the camera had everything. He told me the hired gun was coming Thursday at 10, and he told me he had something better waiting in the wings. The day before Lambert was due, a woman showed up at my door at 9 in the morning who was nothing like I expected. She was somewhere past 60 herself, small, with sharp eyes behind wire glasses. A no-nonsense doctor named Adele Friedman, who happened to be the chief of geriatric psychiatry at the big university hospital, and who happened to be, my attorney told me, the most respected and most feared expert witness in 3 states. She didn't testify for money. She testified when something made her angry, and the idea of a paid charlatan declaring a sound man incompetent so his children could rob him made Dr. Friedman very angry indeed. She put me through 3 hours that would have humbled a younger man. She gave me 3 words to hold and made me count backward from 100 by 7s and asked me the date and the season and the name of the building and the governor of the state. She had me draw a clock in a complicated shape, and I drew them clean, the way a man draws who spent his life reading instruments. She asked about my work and I told her about flying, about the procedures, about a night. I brought a jet down, with a dead engine into Denver in a snowstorm, and what the checklist said to do. She asked if I managed my own money, and I told her my portfolio was up better than the market, because I'd moved into bonds when the rates turned, and watched her write that down. When she gave me back those 3 words an hour later, I handed them right back to her, without a hitch. At the end, she totaled a test where anything above a certain line counts as a sound mind, and she turned the page around so I could see, and she told me I had scored a perfect mark, and that my reasoning sat in the top fraction of a percent for a man my age, and that she had rarely in 20 years seen anyone do it cleaner. Then her face went hard, and she told me that if the man coming the next day dared to find otherwise, she would personally see his license to practice held up to the light. She left her card and drove off in a sensible little car, and I stood at the window knowing the truth was now written down, signed, dated, and notarized by the last person on earth a hired gun would want to argue with. The trap wasn't just set anymore. It had teeth. Lambert arrived 10 minutes late in a suit that cost more than my first truck, silver hair, a tan, a smile with too many teeth in it. My daughter-in-law let herself in with a key I didn't know she had, called out that they were here like she owned the place. I came out slow, not the confused old man this time, but the angry one. They sat in the living room, dead center in the camera's eye, and Lambert pulled out a little notebook and started in on me, warm and condescending, asking how long I'd been feeling so overwhelmed, so confused. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I wasn't confused. I was furious. He asked what I had to be furious about. I told him betrayal made a man furious, and that the only fog I ever felt was the kind that rolls in when family decides you're worth more declared dead than left alone. His smile flickered. He asked me, just for a baseline, what day it was. I told him the date, the hour, the minute, told him he was 10 minutes late for an appointment my son's wife had made without my permission, and asked if he'd like the zip code too. My daughter-in-law jumped in to cover, the way I knew she would, and every word of it landed on the recorder. I'll spare you the back and forth. He left after an hour, and whatever he wrote in that report, it didn't matter, because I had Dr. Friedman's perfect score sitting in a vault, and I had video of my daughter-in-law coaching a paid witness in my own living room. The case they'd built was a house of cards, and I had been quietly bending the table the whole time. Now I have to tell you about the vault, because that is where my whole life turned over. My attorney called me a few days later and told me to come downtown, that there was a safe deposit box at the bank under my late wife's name that I'd need to open in person, and that he'd be there with me. I didn't even know it existed. Eleanor and I had a box, I thought. The ordinary kind, with the deed and the marriage license and her mother's ring. This was a different box, one she'd opened on her own and never mentioned. The bank officer led us back, and I turned my key, and inside was a single thick envelope with my name on the front in her handwriting. My knees nearly went. I'd have known that handwriting at the bottom of the sea. Inside was a letter, and behind the letter, a stack of legal papers. I'm not going to read you the whole letter, because some things a man keeps. But I'll tell you what was in it. My wife worked 31 years as a clerk in the county probate office. 31 years she sat behind a counter and watched families come apart over money, watched children turn on parents, watched the law get used as a crowbar by people who'd run out of love. She never said much about it at supper. I thought she was just a woman with a steady job. I never once understood that she was the most quietly knowledgeable person about inheritance and guardianship in the entire county, and that she had spent 3 decades watching the exact thing that was now happening to me happen to other people. She wrote that she'd seen what our son was, long before I would let myself see it. She wrote about a fight we'd had once, years back, the only real fight of our marriage, where she'd told me the boy loved my money more than he loved me, and I'd raised my voice and told her never to say such a thing about our child again. She wrote that she didn't blame me, that my goodness was the best thing about me, and also the blind spot that would get me hurt, that I saw our son as the little boy I taught to throw a curveball, and she saw him as the man he'd become. And she wrote that the week after her diagnosis, when she told me she was going to visit her sister to say her goodbyes, that was only half true. She did see her sister, but the real reason she went was to sit down with her sister's husband, who was one of the best trust and estate lawyers in the state, and ask him to help her build a wall so high and so strong that not even our own child could climb it. The papers behind the letter were a declaration of trust, an irrevocable one, set up 6 years before that day in the bank, while she was going through chemotherapy and telling me she was just reorganizing our checkbook. She had moved everything into it. The house transferred out of our names and into the trust, owned outright by it. The brokerage accounts, the bonds, the retirement money, all of it liquidated and moved, every careful dollar we'd saved across 40 years. For 6 years, none of it had belonged to me, and I'd never known. I'd been living in a house I didn't own, and spending dividends from accounts I didn't control, and not once had anything felt different, because she'd built it so nothing would. And here is the genius of what that woman did, the thing I will be in awe of until they put me in the ground. She made me the lifetime beneficiary. That means every dollar of income, every dividend, and every drop of interest flows to me for as long as I live. I keep my house rent-free until the day I die. Nothing about my daily life changes by a single penny. But I am not the trustee. I do not control the principal. I cannot be bullied into selling the house, because I do not have the legal power to sell it. I cannot be tricked or pressured or declared incompetent into liquidating the accounts, because they are not mine to liquidate. A court cannot order me to do what I have no authority to do. My wife had turned me into a man who could be loved and fed and housed by his fortune, but could never, under any law in any courtroom, be forced to give it away. She'd seen the guardianship trick coming from 6 years out and built a fortress where the prize was bolted to the floor. And then there was the clause. My attorney read it to me right there in the little viewing room, his voice steady. Any beneficiary named in the trust who challenged it, contested it, or initiated any guardianship or conservatorship action against the lifetime beneficiary, meaning me, would be treated under the law as having died before my wife. That person, and all of their descendants, would be permanently and completely cut out. She had written our son's name into it specifically. She'd given him a test from beyond the grave. He could love his father and wait, or he could reach for it all, and if he reached, the reaching itself would erase him. But she'd thought of one more thing, the thing that tells you everything about who Eleanor was. She knew our granddaughter was innocent, so she'd built a separate subtrust inside the main one, a fund just for the grandchildren, controlled entirely by the trustee and walled off from their parents completely. Whatever her son did, whatever he lost, our granddaughter's education and care were already paid for, untouchable, kept safe from the very people who'd raised her. My wife reached forward across 6 years and 3 of those in the grave to make sure the one blameless person in this whole sorry business would never go without. And the trustee, the person she chose to guard all of it? Not me. Not my attorney, whom our son knew and would have fought. She chose my niece, a quiet woman named Tabitha, my late brother's girl, a special education teacher 2 towns over who'd never had 2 nickels to rub together and never wanted them, a woman my daughter-in-law used to call the church mouse cousin and didn't bother inviting to her own parties. My wife chose her precisely because no one would ever look at her, because she was honest down to the marrow and would no more steal a dime than fly to the moon. Tabitha had known for 6 years. She'd kept the secret through my wife's funeral, kept it through every supper, kept it the whole time, waiting for a day she prayed would never come. I won't pretend the courtroom part was long or dramatic. It wasn't. My son's lawyer walked in expecting to fight over my mind, and instead got handed a perfect psychiatric evaluation from the most feared expert in the region. A stack of recordings of his clients coaching a paid witness and hiding the title of a power of attorney under a manicured thumb and a 6-year-old irrevocable trust that meant the thing they were fighting to control had not been mine to surrender, since before the lawsuit was a glimmer in anyone's eye. And then my attorney read the no contest clause aloud in the hallway outside the courtroom, with my son and his wife standing right there, and explained in plain words what it meant. It meant that by filing that petition, by reaching for all of it, my son had not gained a guardianship. He had triggered a clause his own mother wrote, and legally and permanently disinherited himself. Everything that might one day have come to him was gone the instant he filed, and there was no taking it back. My son's wife didn't scream. She just sort of folded, all the air going out of her, her hand finding the wall. My son stood there looking at me like a man who'd just watched the ground open and asked me what it meant, and I told him. I told him his mother had given him a choice and he'd chosen wrong, and that I was sorry, and I found that I was. Sorry the way you're sorry at a graveside. Sorry for the boy he'd been, not for the man. It's been a little over a year now. I'm sitting on my own front porch as I tell you this, in the same chair I've sat in for 20 years, in the house that is now and forever simply my home, no longer a target, no longer a prize. The hired gun, Lambert, had his sham evaluation and Dr. Friedman's report sent to the state medical board, and his license to practice was pulled for good. My son's attorney drew a suspension of his own for putting a fraud in front of a court. And my son and his daughter-in-law, with no inheritance coming and no house to sell, and a hole in the ground where $600,000 used to be, lost everything the slow, ordinary way. The bank took the stone house. The cars went back. They filed bankruptcy in the spring. They tried to burn down my life to warm their hands, and in the end the only thing that burned was theirs. My granddaughter is fine. Better than fine. She comes and stays with me some weekends, and her schooling and her future are paid for, out of a fund her parents can't touch, and never knew existed, exactly the way her grandmother planned it. My niece Tabitha drives up once a quarter, still in her school clothes half the time, and we sit at the kitchen table and go over the trust together, the 2 of us, the whole board of directors of my wife's last and greatest piece of work. And every year, on Eleanor's instruction written into the trust in her own steady hand, a quarter of the income from that estate goes to Alzheimer's research at the university hospital, in her name. They told the court my mind was gone. My wife turned that lie into a weapon against the one disease that truly steals a mind, and signed it with her name. I don't know that I've ever loved her more than the day I figured that out. I lost a son this year. I want to be honest about that, because I don't think any amount of being right makes that not hurt. The boy I loved was real once, even if the man wasn't, and I grieve him. But I learned something I'd have rather learned a gentler way. I learned that I helped build the man who came for me, that every consequence I cushioned and every check I wrote without a question taught him the floor would always hold, and that love without a limit isn't love at all. It's just a slow way of teaching somebody they're owed the world. My wife knew that. She loved harder than I ever did, and she was the one with the spine to build a wall. The greatest thing she ever did for me wasn't the giving, it was the protecting. And I learned, too late to tell her, that quiet isn't the same as weak, and that sometimes when a person goes silent, it isn't because they've given up. Sometimes silence is just the sound of someone reloading. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with somebody you loved more than your own life? Tell me about it down in the comments. I'll be reading.